Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for clicking on the video. The only channel on YouTube to where if you don't like the content, we give you your money back. That's right, fully 100% refundable. I've got 5 stories in this set and I know you're gonna love them. Let's get rolling. All right, here we go. This story was emailed to us from Gerald, and it's a really good one. I love the way he's framed this story. I think you're going to like it. He writes, "It was Saturday afternoon during the summer of 1962. I was 12 years old at the time. My mother's sister, Alice, had called from her family's farm in north central Indiana's Lake District to invite us to visit them that evening and have supper. My mother said that we would be there. Mom, Dad, and my older sister and I finished up what we were doing at home, cutting grass, washing cars, sweeping out the garage, and piled into Dad's old Chevy Bel Air and drove the 20 miles or so to my Aunt Alice and Uncle Herb's farm. My Uncle Herb farmed corn, soybeans, and in the last 2 years had been raising black Angus cattle in addition to his big hog operation. Their farm was typical for Indiana in those days before the big agro-business outfits had taken over much of the old family-run farms. Back then, many farms had been in the same families for generations. No one would consider selling their land. If someone sold their land, it was considered that they had given up, and no one wanted to give up. Herb's farm, several hundred acres, included woodlots and creeks, and was one of several in that area where everyone knew each other, they helped each other out, and all the kids went to the little small-town high schools before school consolidation rolled them all into bigger districts. We pulled in after a long drive, past their rural mailbox and a beautiful wax bean field, and my dad, Herb, and I sat out talking while the women finished the meal, and then we ate in the shade outdoors. We had barbecue chicken, potatoes, and fresh green beans, and heaping platters of hot rolls and lemonade. "Ray," Herb said to my dad, "would you mind helping me out with a little chore? I need to run some salt blocks out to the herd." "Sure," my dad said. "Let's go." I asked if I could go along because the women would just be cleaning up and gabbing, and my cousin Bob wasn't home, so there would be nothing for me to do. Herb said that I might be useful, so we all helped to load the salt blocks in the bed of Herb's beat-up Chevy truck. He had a shotgun rack in the cab, and he took it down and loaded it. That drew a look from my father, and then Herb brought down another rifle, an M1 carbine, a highly prized semi-auto rifle similar to the type that my dad had carried in Anzio in Italy during the war. "Ray, do you remember how to handle one of these, right?" he asked. "I do, Herb. What's going on?" My dad accepted the rifle, and I remember there was a slightly oily rag draped over the charging handle. We squeezed into the cab and took off into the field. We drove way out to Herb's large and placid herd of black Angus cattle. It was twilight now, and the sun was beginning to set. It was all red, gold, and purple, and decorated by God. "Okay," Herb began, "I didn't want to talk about this too much in front of the women. Do you remember back at Nadine's high school graduation in May, and I was telling you about that guy who had escaped from Beatty's? Now, Beatty's is a Memorial State hospital and was used to lock up Indiana's criminally and dangerously insane. Herb's farm was in Wanata and was not far from the infamous rural hospital in Westville, Indiana." Herb continued, "This crazy guy escaped from there and was living wild out in the country. Cops couldn't catch him. They started calling him the Eggman because he would sneak around and break into hen houses at night, stealing eggs and hens and all that. The women were pretty scared because for the most part they were alone during the day when we are out working and the kids are in school. Alice is alone all day, and some of us got pretty hard on the sheriff because they couldn't run this fella down. Then we had things happen here. Tools came up missing. Somebody was messing with Alice's garden and monkeying around with some of my machinery. Then I found one of my calves dead, and the mother had run off. That calf had been torn up pretty bad and partially eaten. Its tongue had been ripped out, not cut, it was ripped out. I called Harold Warner, the sheriff, and I complained. I was pretty angry, and then Harold told me, "Herb, you need to calm down, because we caught that guy and he's back in security in Westville. He's been there for 2 weeks." By this time, my father and I were paying close attention and hanging on every word that Herb said. We had driven out to the herd and were unloading the salt blocks by the side of the dusty farm track. It was twilight, and there were faint stars, and they were beginning to show. Herb continued, "There's nothing in the state of Indiana, not up here by the lakes, that can run down a black Angus calf in the middle of a herd and run its mother off and rip it apart and eat it." I got scared, and I started asking around. Carl Martin, you remember him, his family is from Bass Lake. Well, he's having trouble too. Some of his barns have been broke into, and small animals are missing. Herb looked at the dusty ground and said, "Would you look at this? Here's another one." Herb knelt over and pointed to an enormous footprint in the dust. It must have been 17 or 18 inches long and 8 or 9 inches wide. My dad knelt down and looked at it, and then he looked around us at the trees and the brush line along the trail. He was holding that rifle with a little more conviction now. There was just enough light that I could clearly see the tracks. "What is it?" he asked finally. "What made this?" "No one knows," Herb said. "We started finding them all over the place, at the creek crossings, around outbuildings, even around our houses. Carl said that Victor Kessler thinks that he has seen it once or twice in the morning or at dusk. Just a glimpse, though. Whatever it is, it's big," he said. "It's really big. The Kreidler boys saw it late one night coming back from a dance over at English Lake. It ran across the highway in front of them, and they were really shook up about it. Ron Kreidler said it was like an ape or a gorilla, and it ran on 2 feet over the road, and it disappeared." Herb shook his head. "We're all taking precautions now." The men stood up. The vast landscape had vanished into the darkness. I remember putting my small hand into the giant footprint. For maybe the first time in my life, I realized how big, how immense the world really is, and how that there are mysteries, many mysteries, things unknown, things that take on a new significance in the dusk and in the growing darkness. Gerald, that's a great story, 1962. I'm not really sure. I can just picture all that. I mean, you as a little kid looking down at this giant footprint, and you know these guys weren't messing with you. This was the real thing. And all the evidence and all the animals missing and people seeing this thing all around. I'm not familiar with that part of Indiana. I'm not really familiar with Indiana at all. Maybe a little bit of southern Indiana. I used to goose hunt there. But anyway, not much to say about that. That's a great nostalgic story. I really appreciate you sending it in, Gerald. That's a good one. Thanks, buddy. Here's an email from Carol that I actually got back last February. Carol, I'm sorry it's taken so long to get to this story, but I had a problem with my emails. I'm not going to bore you with that problem now. But about 300 emails dumped over into a folder I had set up for already read emails, and it wasn't. And I've had to go back and dig out all these emails, and I'm getting to them now. But Carol writes, "I have a story to tell that occurred in Ocala National Forest in 1964. I've never told this to anyone, and I feel it's time to share my experience. I was 13 years old and spent all my weekends and summers down on Lake Delancey, where my father had built a second home. We would have a blast fishing, skiing, and waterboarding. I grew up down in the forest on the lake and in the surrounding area. 2 of my uncles bought property on the lake and built homes also, so that made for a total of 8 homes on this lake, and it's a nice-sized lake. It was a place where we could go and run wild without getting in trouble. One Saturday, Dad wanted to fish a small lake. I would call it more of a nice-sized pond called Little Buckskin, not far from Delancey. We drove as close as we could, leaving the truck on the side of the sandy dirt road to make the trek to the lake carrying the canoe. There was no easy access to this pond, and we had to hack our way through brush to get the canoe in. We fished for about 3 hours and we didn't catch anything. And then we heard a large commotion on the south end of the lake. The palmetto brush was being shaken violently, and I could see pine trees swaying back and forth, and something was screeching like a banshee. I saw something black in those woods running back and forth. It didn't stand completely upright. It was on all fours most of the time. This went on for about 10 minutes, and it scared me enough that I wanted to leave. I asked Dad what that was, and he said it was black panthers mating. Geez, I was young, and even I didn't believe there were black panthers in Central Florida. Finally, Dad said we would call it quits, so we packed out a lot faster than we packed in. I've never seen a Bigfoot, a skunk ape, or anything of that nature, but I do know that that was no black panther. I Google Earth that section of the forest, and now it's all grown up and with houses, and it looks nothing like it did when I was young. But that was 55 years ago. I'm sure if there were great apes in that area, they are long gone now due to the overpopulation in that area. Thanks for listening to an old lady's youth. Thanks, Carol. I'm sorry it took so long to get to your story, and it was my mistake. And I've read a few of those from that time that I got them, but I'm just kind of sprinkling them in and out through there. So I just wanted to let you guys know that. But Carol, that's a great story. Now, here's the thing. I don't doubt the experience at all. I think you saw something that scared you to death, and it was probably loud, shaking vegetation around the south end of that lake. But if it stayed on all fours for the most part, I think there's black bears in the Florida swamps. I think. And do you think that could have been a black bear? I'm just wondering. But if not, if you'd have seen it stand up on two legs and walk around, I think that would be more confirmation in your mind that it may have been what Floridians call the skunk ape or a swamp squatch or whatever. At any rate, that's an interesting story, and I think people have these experiences a lot. I think they see things, but they can't really see exactly what it is, and at the time, they don't think much about it. They just think it's a weird occurrence. But then years later, they start thinking about it, and they may hear a YouTube channel like this one or others, and they may say, maybe there's more to that experience than what I thought it was, because deep in your heart, it was just weird. I mean, if it was something natural, you probably wouldn't remember those things so vividly. But anyway, I'm just rambling on. I just thought it was a good story and a good one to share. And you're welcome for listening to an old lady's youth. And I really appreciate you, Carol. Thank you, ma'am. This is a good one. I think it's a Dogman story. I'm pretty sure it is. But here's what the man writes. I stumbled upon your YouTube page and I really like listening to the stories. It's a different way, the way you present these stories and make them very enjoyable. Well, thank you. This is not a Bigfoot story, but it's a strange one just the same. I would prefer you not use my name if you don't mind, as people think I'm crazy enough already. I grew up in North Mississippi where I spent a ton of time in the woods near our home. I fished and I tried to hunt deer, even though back then there weren't as plentiful as they are now. I guess what I'm saying is I've spent a ton of time out and about, and I've seen all sorts of critters. I joined the Army in 1987. I spent 4 years total, and 3.5 of them in Germany after basic training in AIT. I worked as an MP, and as I reflect on it now, I had a great time and I met some great folks from all over the country. I was assigned to the Provost Marshal and not a standard MP unit, so I didn't go into the field, which in some ways was good, in some ways not so good. I've only shared this story with a handful of people over the years. It was 1989 and I had been in Germany for about 2 years. I was working the graveyard shift and I think it was around 1 a.m. I was on my way back to the MP station after patrolling in a housing area off post in one of the old Chrysler K cars that we used. The 4-lane highway I was on reminded me of the smaller 4 lanes back home. This summer night was bright. I don't recall what stage the moon was in, but it was crystal clear. As I approached an overpass, I saw something on the left side of the other 2 lanes coming down off the incline. I thought at first that it was a deer because the area just outside where I was stationed was mainly farming fields. This animal came down the slight incline from above the 4-lane highway that I was on. There were concrete support columns in the middle of the grassy area between the 4 lanes. There was a slight ledge there that the column of concrete was wider than the part of the overpass that it was supporting. I tell you this so that you have an idea of how surprised I was when whatever this creature was took a jump from the grassy hill it was coming down and landed in the middle of the opposing 2 lanes. It made another jump to the ledge just under the overpass. I have no idea how far or how high that is, but you get the idea. By this time I was almost to a stop. There was no other traffic in either direction. This creature then jumped from the ledge it was on to the center of the 2 lanes I was driving on, and it paused. It looked in my direction, and then it made another leap off the highway and it was gone. I had lights on the outside of my car, and I tried to shine one in the tall grass to try to get another glimpse of whatever this was. I even pulled my .45 out and laid it on the seat next to me. I wasn't scared, but I was cautious, I guess, because I couldn't process in my brain what I had just seen. I didn't see it again, and I decided to get out of there. I don't know what I saw, but I know what it looked like. It was a dark gray color. It was on all 4s, and it seemed a little shorter in the back, if that makes sense. It was kind of tapered from the head to the tail. It had a snout like a dog, but longer, more like a shepherd. It had longer hair around the head and neck, and it seemed to get shorter and shorter the further it went down to the tail. I recall a tail, but I really don't remember much about it. If I had to guess, I would say that this thing was maybe 150 pounds or so. Now that's a complete guess. It could have been smaller or larger, but it was about the size of one of the really big shepherd type dogs. I don't recall any eyeshine either, which thinking back is odd. I didn't tell anyone this story for a long time. I didn't want them thinking I was some nut and booting me out of the army. I've shared this story with only a few folks in my life. I've shown my kids the exact overpass on Google Earth so they would have a better understanding of the lay of the land. I know this story is wild and I would have a hard time with it if it hadn't happened to me. I never saw anything like this again. I don't know what it was, only how it looked and the crazy athletic ability it had. I don't know of anything that can jump like that. Woo, that's a cool story, and that happened in Germany. That sounds like a dog man, or what people call a dog man. It doesn't sound like a Bigfoot at all. Germany, I hear from Europeans on occasion, and I think they believe they have some of the same creatures that we have here in North America. And it's interesting. And they're eyewitnesses, just like this one from Europe. Any Europeans listening? Send me your stories because we'd love to hear them. All right, let's go to another one. This story is from Don. I assume he lives in California. I'm making an assumption because the event happens in Yosemite. And he writes, a lot of people have had scary encounters. Well, here's mine. This story is real. I've been hiking the Sierras for 40 years, and I unwittingly have seen and heard evidence of Sasquatch numerous times, but I didn't know how to interpret what I was looking at until this event happened. When I was 51, back in 1993, I went hiking in Yosemite alone. At the trailhead going up to Cloud's Rest, there were 4 other hikers going up as well. 3 young women, and one was with her boyfriend or husband, I'm not sure. They asked if I wanted to join their group for safety reasons. I agreed, so we started our hike. Cloud's Rest is about 10,000 feet in elevation, so we were hiking up all the way. Although it was late October, the weather was perfect. Cloud's Rest is at the edge of a tree line at that elevation. This is important to remember. The other hikers set up camp at the edge of a cliff. This is not my idea of a good time. So I decided to move about 30 feet or so back down the trail on a flat spot by a tall, skinny pine tree. But I didn't pitch my tent at that time. I thought if the wind kicked up, I would be far enough away from the cliff to be sheltered from the wind. We talked till about 11 o'clock. It was the most beautiful night I have ever had in the Sierras. It was calm and there was no wind. When they went to bed, I grabbed my dome tent. I walked down to the spot I cleared off and used my flashlight to set up my tent. I have to say I felt like I was being watched, but I thought it was just being nervous in the dark. I hopped into my tent and went into the sleeping bag, but I got hot, so I got out of the bag and laid on top. I was still hot, so I stripped down to my underwear. Keep in mind, this is late October and we were at 10,000 feet. I had dozed off and my tent started shaking violently. I thought the wind picked up, but then my tent started to lift up about 8 or 9 inches at my feet. This seemed serious, so I moved down to curl up and weigh the tent down, and it dropped. But the shaking continued as if the wind was still blowing. In this position, the cross members of the dome structure were directly above my head. Eventually, I began to doze off again when the tent slammed straight down on my head. The cross members of the structural hit the side of my face. The only thing that has hit me that hard was when I was thrown through a windshield in a car accident. I screamed out in pain, and then everything stopped as if the wind just died. The next morning, I got up to see how the others held up in the windstorm. I asked how the wind affected their night, and they just stared at me, and then one of them said, "What wind? It was calm all night long." They went on to say that it was the most calm night they had ever spent in the Sierras, and that it is usually pretty windy. 14 years later, my wife and I were laying in bed watching an account of a Bigfoot encounter in Alaska, and they described what was exactly happening to me, but they saw it because of the midnight sun. I couldn't believe it. There was no wind. There was no bear. As some have said, they don't lift up tents. It was no raccoon or puma. None of that makes any sense if you think about it. Although I didn't see him, I know that I was harassed by a Sasquatch. Why else would everything just stop when I screamed out and then turned on my light to see the damage to my tent? People don't believe me, but I hope you do, because this really happened. Trust me, they're out there. Well, Don, I don't have any reason not to believe you, and I understand exactly what you're talking about, because there you are laying in your tent. All of a sudden it just starts shaking like the wind's blowing for no reason at all. And then the tent starts lifting up. Now, if it was just shaking, you could kind of write it off as maybe just a short period of wind or something like that. But then the end of your tent starts to lift up so much that you have to crawl down to the bottom to keep it down to the ground. Then it collapses on your head. Man, that would scare the crap out of me. And then to get up the next morning, and all the other hikers who slept virtually in the same area that you did said it was the calmest night they had ever spent in the Sierras. I don't think any other animal is going to just sit there and shake a tent for no reason. Maybe a bear could get his foot hung up in the structure of your dome, but your structure was on the inside of the tent. It wasn't an exostructure like some of these tents do. So that's weird, man. I believe what you're saying. I don't have any reason to doubt that. And there are probably thousands of stories just like this. Anyway, this is a good encounter story, Don. I appreciate you sending it, buddy. Okay, this last story is from Georgia. The man who wrote the email, his name is Eddie. And this is a really good email. I love this story. I've also got a dog behind me here snoring, and I know you guys have, if you've listened to the channel a while, you've heard it before. So you know I'm not going to wake my dog up to record this video. So if you hear some dog snoring, just deal with it. But here's what Eddie writes. I appreciate what you do and how you do it. I'm from Georgia, and I've had multiple experience with wood boogers. I take clients hunting on 2,100 acres on the Flint River in northwest Georgia. I've seen them and I've heard them talk. I have even heard the young ones laughing. There's an alpha male in the group who governs, and I call him George. I have been around him now for over 30 years, and we have an understanding. He tolerates me, and he has never shown aggression but once. One morning, a while back, 2 of my hunting clients were moving to their deer stands in a golf cart. The sun had not come up and it was dark. They came to a creek and they stopped, and when things got quiet, they heard a series of growls in the woods close by. Nothing growls like that in these woods. They got spooked when the growls got closer. They said the sound was vibrating them and the golf cart at the same time. Then everything got real quiet. The quiet was suddenly broken by a scream/roar that sounded like a freight train horn not 20 feet away. It was so intense that they claimed their inner organs were bouncing around in their bodies, and the cart they sat on was vibrating violently. They fumbled for the reverse gear, backed up the trail, and hightailed it back to the cabin. I was there making coffee and catching the news on TV. They busted in the door wide-eyed and white as sheets, and they asked if I heard it. Heard what? I asked. That roar. When they told me where this happened, I knew what was going on. So I told them that George... I'm sorry to laugh. This is funny. I told them that George beds his family in that thick bottom. He was probably out working all night and was on his way back to the group. You boys just happened to be on the road that he was walking home on. These wood booger events are common with me. Here is the story of my first encounter with a wood booger. It was the second weekend in October of 1980. I was a senior in college at a school in southwest Georgia. My girlfriend at the time was on a gymnastics scholarship at Western Carolina State University. This was my second visit, and I had learned on my first visit that during their Saturday morning practice, I would become a nonstop taxi service to the girls who could not practice due to injuries. They had all sorts of places they needed to go, and apparently I was the only one that had a car. I guess I could have said no, but these girls were persuasive. So this year and that morning, when my girlfriend left for practice, I dropped her off, and then I went for a walk up the mountain. The woods were so clean compared to the woods I was raised in. It was a nice walk. I was on maybe a 30-degree grade and not bad walking at all. I'd been going for about an hour and a half, and I was looking where I put my feet because it was still warm enough for copperheads and cane brakes, and where I'm from, you're taught early not to step on snakes. I heard a bob white to my forward and right, but it was only the front end of the call. It didn't finish, and it was louder than any bob white I'd ever heard. So I looked directly at the sound about my 1 o'clock, and not 50 feet from where I was standing, 40 feet up in a tree, there he was, looking dead at me. I had no idea what this thing was, and it appeared to be about my size or maybe bigger. I'm about 5'10" and 220 pounds. It was solid black with charcoal gray framed around its dark face. It had big brown amber eyes, a wide hooded nose that was almost flat, and his mouth was pooched to a point and a little open. His mouth was shaped in an O. It was that look of, I think he sees me. A family in my hometown had a pet gibbon 8 named Sinbad, and I immediately thought it was a giant gibbon, mainly because of the charcoal gray frame around its face. I moved to my left to look for a tail, knowing it had to be an ape due to the size, and sure enough, It had a fanny, but no tail. So I knew it was an ape. I thought someone had a pet that had gotten too big to handle and had released it. He never moved until I did. He moved to his left when I moved to my left. I think he was trying to keep the trunk of that tree between us. He appeared young and healthy. His hair was clean, and it almost had that kept look. We looked at each other for a while, and I even spoke to him about taking him home to beat up Sinbad. I didn't know what wood boogers were at the time, even though my kinsfolks had all told me and my cousins to be in the house by dark or the boogers would get us. Anyway, we stared at each other for a few minutes, and I had to head back to the dorm. I waved goodbye, and I told him that I'd be back another time. I never did, and I never told anyone for years. And when I did tell someone, it was my oldest friend and his son, and they rolled their eyes at me, so I shut up. And that was my first eyeballing of a wood booger, and probably still my best. Eddie, that's a great story. I like the way you write and tell that story. I can almost hear you telling this. I can almost hear you telling this in your Georgia accent. It's a great story, and apparently you're taking people hunting on some property that's probably covered up with these things, and you probably know a lot about these. You might be somebody I'd like to interview. So shoot me an email if you're interested in that. At any rate, this is a great story, and I really appreciate you, buddy. Thanks. All right, there's 5 stories in the books. That was so much fun. I'm having so much fun doing this, I can't stand it. I wish I could do it full time, and maybe someday I'll be able to. I don't know. But that's going to wrap this video up. Thank you all again for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks.